Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and to take the day off from Brexit again on Sunday, I'm going to talk about something that's quite a serious subject, actually. Now, when it comes to the imperial past of Britain, you'll find people in the UK basically one of two camps. There are those of us who understand that the days of empire are gone, and not just for us, but for the world. Modern society doesn't, or at least shouldn't, tolerate that sort of behaviour. Then there are those who think that we still have it, and that those days never ended. They simply declined, and that it's a good thing. And there's a lot of historical ignorance about these events on both sides, which is a shame because every lie told about history increases the chances of us repeating it. When an individual doesn't learn from mistakes, that's a shame. When a nation doesn't learn from mistakes, that's an atrocity. And I'll make no apologies, for the image behind me, because at the end of the day, if your inclination is to look away, that's the inclination to not want to face up to anything. According to Jacob Rees Mogg, speaking on the BBC, the concentration camps during the Boer War of the late 19th century, early 20th century were for humanitarian purposes. He was applauded by the audience and unchallenged by the programme host. This is a disgraceful way to present anything on what is supposed to be an independent news channel. Anyone who ever came across a concentration camp and thought that it benefited the residents or did anything other than bring shame on its masters? No, didn't think so. And it's no different here. In fact, the term concentration camp, I believe, arose out of this war. So let's set the record straight on yet another litany of poison to come out of this evil man's mouth. First of all, how did this become a topic for discussion? Basically, going back a few days, in an interview, John McDonnell, who's the Shadow Chancellor and basically Jeremy Corbyn's right-hand man in the Parliamentary Labour Party, was asked in an interview if Winston Churchill was a hero or a villain. Now, obviously, anyone with any political acumen at all would instantly see the trap for what it was and respond, "Oh, an absolute hero," while he had Labour MPs in his cabinet, and leave it at that and not say anything else. The interviewers knew full well that the Second World War was Winston Churchill's only redeeming period. And it was a glorious one for him, absolutely no doubt about it. But before that, his time in office and out of it was fairly monstrous. There was a mixture of incompetence and heartlessness about his actions. And so McDonnell, on that basis, labelled him a villain. But he was the man for the job as Prime Minister during the Second World War. He made the correct decisions. And he also insisted on a government of national unity, which included giving Labour MPs senior positions in cabinet. That gave McDonnell basically an easy answer, which he singularly failed to grasp. But anyway, this isn't about the political naivety of senior members of the Labour Party, but the despicable behaviour about someone on the government benches. With more power, I have to say, than I am easy with. So, as to the concentration camps in the Boer War, for those who aren't aware, it's a fairly famous war in the UK and South Africa, of course. Outside of that, maybe less so. It was fought at the turn of the 20th century when the British were still of an imperial mindset and in the process of nicking countries. It was sort of coming to an end, I suppose. Now, unlike in the days when the British Empire would basically, go against countries where they could use their rifles against people with spears, this time they had to contend with rifle fire in return. They did, however, outnumber the Boer forces, but although the Boers were outnumbered, the British were fighting in difficult terrain and didn't understand that terrain as well as the people they were fighting against. The war was effectively over control of mineral resources, gold in this case, as it often was. The British High Commissioner at the time, Alfred Milner, had moved to expand the control of the British over newly discovered sources of gold. In other words, they'd set up this agreement. It's like, right, this is what Britain controls. This is what you can control. Oh, you've got gold there. Right, we're having that. So as Milner brought in more and more troops, he was able to force concessions from the Boers, who were a bit alarmed about the military build-up. And it's not exactly like the British were known for respecting boundaries. He knew exactly where this was going. So he gave concession after concession. But Milner was too greedy for anything less than everything. So in the end, war was inevitable. And then we come to the concentration camps. So these were initially just refugee camps. It also has to be borne in mind that the British initially weren't doing that well. Now, naturally, when war breaks out, innocent citizens end up having to flee their homes and farmsteads for safety. But when Kitchener took over, he saw an opportunity to put pressure on the Boers, who, as I say, were applying very successful tactics, guerrilla tactics, exactly what you would do if you're fighting against a much larger army. So he intended to hit them where it hurts, women and children. So he initially pursued a policy, a scorched earth policy. So burning down villages, burning down farmsteads, setting fire to crops, slaughtering livestock, poisoning water sources, rendering the land infertile so you couldn't grow on it after it as well. So in this case, people were sort of having to make their way to these refugee camps, as they were called, and those who didn't head there were forced to go there by the British. The camps were segregated into whites and blacks, and as the camps grew in size, it became impossible to administer them properly. Hunger and disease ran rampant. And before this ended, and this lasted like about 2 or 3 years, nearly 50,000 people had died. And of those 50,000, almost 80% of them were children. Now, as news of the atrocities reached the UK, both public and political opposition became quite fierce. Now, people do have a tendency to condemn those from history for behaviours that wouldn't be tolerated today, of course, but were the way to achieve things then. People keep viewing history through the lens of today. But these actions were not of their time. They were seen as barbaric at the time by people in public as well as many politicians. The Secretary of State for War initially tried to explain it away by saying that the camps were voluntary, as Jacob Rees Mogg's trying to say, for humanitarian purposes. No one believed that. So then he tried to say that it was a military necessity. That didn't really cut much ice either. Now, a prominent Liberal politician of the time, still famous today, David Lloyd George, took up the banner and kept pressing the government in Parliament over this barbarism. The public outcry also increased, so the government were forced to appoint a commission in the hope that it would defend their position. After all, that's why you appoint commissions, so they can go off and find evidence that the government was right all along. Unfortunately for them, when they toured these South African camps, they found that actually not only were all the accusations perfectly true, but if anything, it was worse than anyone was really describing. So the government was then forced to put the commission in charge of the administration of the camps, at which point the mortality rate was massively reduced, right down to about 2%. Now, arguments have raged since whether on the part of Kitchener it was a deliberate policy of genocide or ethnic cleansing as we'd call it today, which I don't know why, because that's just intended to somehow make it sound less heinous. It's genocide. Or just incompetence. But the bottom line is that it was a deliberate attempt to use human suffering to bring an enemy to heel. There was nothing humanitarian about the motivations for this policy whatsoever.
I'm afraid you're confusing concentration camps with Hitler's extermination camps.
I'm not saying they're the same thing. I'm saying that any concentration camp is de facto an awful, awful thing.
These were people who were interned for their safety. Now, that is not a good thing. I'm not in favour.
Hundreds of thousands of people died.
The death rate was exactly the same as in Glasgow. Death rates 100 years ago were considerably higher than they are now for all sorts of reasons, including...
It was systematic murder.
Now, note something else he said there. It's also... trying to compare it to the number of deaths in Glasgow at the time is similarly misleading. Glasgow had a population of about 750,000 in 1900. There was a little over 100,000 people interned in these concentration camps in the Boer War. So the actual death rate was catastrophic and nothing like it was in Glasgow at the time. Again, this is a deliberate misuse of statistics to try and put forward a point that is wholly untrue. Besides, nobody was deliberately exterminating people in Glasgow, other than potentially other Glaswegians on a Friday night in the pub, as continues today. Now, at the end of the day, this man, whom people follow, is basically a monster of the most callous disposition. It fills me with horror to think of the hold he has over my country. Now, I'm not going to induce Godwin's law here, but I am thinking it bloody loudly. And this is the problem you have when you have people of influence who can justify acts of the most unspeakable horror. You simply cannot allow these people to hold sway over the lives of anyone, much less an entire nation. We know what happens when you allow this to occur. We need to start learning from history, not making excuses and just repeat it again. But unfortunately, I fear that that's just the way we're headed. So anyway, I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe for further content, and click the bell notification to be notified of further content. Remember, the poll for tomorrow's discussion is still up. You can find that by clicking the channel name and then going to the community tab. Until next time, I'll see you later.